Good afternoon, friends. I'm so happy to see everyone today and to have my friend Jake Stewart with us. There is so much going on in the world with you guys and federal and state initiatives, some big announcements. I will get Jake's take on how positive those were, some big announcements in the last week. And I'm super excited that we have a resource in Jake who has his finger on the pulse of what is happening on the state level, which is really hard for us to get a handle on because, well, there are a lot of them. And for us to focus on the federal level makes it really difficult to drill down into what is happening from a state perspective, who's doing things well, who might need a little push from you guys if you're providers in that state. And I'd just like to introduce you to Jake first. I'm so happy you're here, Jake. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so I'd also like to mention that Jake has been such a wealth of information that he is also going to be our industry keynote at our upcoming SHIFT conference in December. And I feel like that information will be real timely, and I'm sure you'll tell us more about your expectation, Jake, of what information you might have at that time. But could you just give us an overview of ECEC, where you work, and what their mission is, what your role is, and whatever you think is real for us?
Absolutely. Thanks, Kathy. So ECEC stands for the Early Care and Education Consortium. And we are a membership-based nonprofit. We function similar to an association. Our members are high-quality childcare providers, most of whom are multi-site, many of whom are multi-state. We also have members who might be state associations, so they represent, a broad array of childcare providers, from center-based to family childcare providers. And then we have some education service providers as well, and they make up our members. But the goal of ECEC is to try to expand access to high quality childcare. We know that this is a key question on the minds of policymakers right now. And so a big part of this from our perspective is making sure that those that work in the industry, from providers to those who support providers, are at the table when it comes to these conversations around childcare and early learning. And whether that's at the federal level, where we know a lot is decided, but also at the state level or at the local level, where we know a lot is starting to happen. And I think over the next few years, we'll continue to see a lot to happen. It is our goal to make sure that the provider perspective is well represented. I am the director of state government relations, so I get a very unique perspective into all of the states that our members operate in, which, if you add our members together, it's 48 states across the country, and we work closely, not just with other policymakers in those states, but we work closely with advocates, stakeholders, and of course our providers to try to make sure that these conversations are happening and that the solutions states are thinking of are really taking into account the provider perspective. Prior to joining ECEC, I was with Childcare Aware of America for a few years, where I focused primarily on federal advocacy, a little bit on state as well. Prior to that, I did also used to work on Capitol Hill for a senator. And then prior to that, and to me, this is the most important experience, I actually used to be a teacher. I was a middle school teacher in New Mexico, and I think that really helps inform a lot of my experience, both why I think early childhood is important, but also the workforce side. And we know that right now the industry is really struggling with the workforce piece. So that is the ECEC perspective and where I'm coming from.
That's such a unique set of experiences. And I love that your initial background came from actual teaching. It's a tough job, especially these days. But it must be challenging to keep up with initiatives and contacts in 48 states? How does that work? How does that look for you?
It's a great question. So we do have some priority states where we're tracking big movements. So that could be something like just a large state like California, Texas, Florida, the more populated states. But there are some states where we know some interesting things are happening that I think all eyes should be on right now. Colorado is a big one. Colorado is implementing its universal preschool program. And by next year, it's supposed to have 10 hours of free preschool a week. And Colorado is also intending to make this a very strong mixed delivery program that includes both public and private providers. Of course, when it comes to this type of initiative, the devil's in the details. And so we're going to see how this works out, but we have been working closely with officials in Colorado to help make that happen. But I think it really highlights an important question that we're starting to see policymakers grapple with, which is, we know childcare is important. We know preschool is important, which, it took a while to finally get there, and it took a pandemic to finally get there, but we finally have policymakers paying attention. The next question is, how do we get there? What does mixed delivery preschool look like? And what does childcare access and expanding access, what does that look like? And unfortunately, no state is doing this perfectly. So this is kind of the Wild West in terms of that arena. And so we're trying to monitor those states that are working towards getting there. Colorado is one of those. Washington State recently passed sweeping legislation, the Fair Start for Kids Act, which was passed last year. Massachusetts has a universal proposal. So these states we choose because we think that there are very interesting things happening. We think providers absolutely need to be at the table in those conversations, because those states could become trendsetters. And we want to make sure that if they do, that the trend is a good one.
Yeah, I want to know more about some specific models that you like, but before we get there, let's talk a little bit about mixed delivery, because you really hit on the heart of, this is my 38th year in the industry, and frankly, at least 25 of those years, we've had serious conversations about competition from sources that we don't get to participate in and the threat that poses to the industry. Do you feel like in general we're moving toward an understanding from entities that make these decisions that is necessary to allow multiple services to participate, and the threat on infants, toddlers, 2s and 3s, and after school if we suddenly strip out 4 and 5-year-olds?
It's a great question. And if you would have asked that a few years ago, I would have said no. In fact, I don't think it would have been few and far between that I talked to a policymaker that could even articulate the phrase mixed delivery, let alone, talk about what it was. Now that we have more politicians paying attention to it, I have started to see a bigger push for mixed delivery. A great example, actually a couple examples, in California, there is a threat right now, a very serious threat that many may have heard about, transitional kindergarten. And transitional kindergarten, just so you know, it's also known as TK. Sounds like pre-K. Some politicians think it's pre-K, but it's not. It was designed to be sort of a way for those children who were on the cusp of the deadline for entering kindergarten to still have a place to go. So in California, that cusp was September 2nd. So they created this program for kids whose birthdays are between September 2nd and December 2nd to basically function as like a quasi kindergarten, just a place to go for those parents. What that has turned into has been basically a cheaper, in the eyes of the state, a cheaper way to get to what they think is universal preschool. And I emphasize that because TK lacks a lot of the qualities that we know would go into an adequate preschool program for children. And it's entirely ran out of public schools, unless the public school opts to, contract out those services. So this is a big threat to the field, of course, and it's already been passed. This upcoming fall is actually the first year that they're going to start expanding TK access. So they're going to push back that December 2nd date to February 2nd. And they're going to keep doing that for the next 4 or 5 years until all 4-year-olds are now eligible. And California is going to call this universal preschool. And of course, we were very concerned when this passed, but what we've seen emerge from California are also legislative leaders who are pushing for mixed delivery and true mixed delivery. It comes as no surprise that women tend to understand this issue more quickly. In California, the Democratic Women's Caucus has made mixed delivery preschool one of their priorities for this year. And the chair of that caucus has made this bill her particular priority to try to get mixed delivery preschool throughout the state to run alongside this TK program. We've seen this happen in a few other states recently. In April, we saw the Senate Majority Leader in New Jersey introduce a couple of bills to try to get strong mixed delivery preschool there. New Jersey is what I would call a slow burn, meaning that they are steadily increasing preschool through public schools over time. So it's not necessarily a singular bill like we had in California, but the threat is still there, and it's almost more dangerous because it's slow over time and people don't necessarily look over it. I bring up these examples because this is progress. That I know that we still have these threats on the table, but the fact that we are having some legislators finally step forward and become really strong champions for mixed delivery is fantastic. And those are the examples that I want other states to see, as opposed to the way that the current systems in New Jersey and California operate. And we're really hoping that we can get some more movement in other states as well.
Great information. Couple of questions to piggyback on that. One of the things that you mentioned was that you feel differently now than you did a few years ago. I actually feel like the world sees our industry differently than it did pre-COVID in a very positive way. Do you think that was a major factor in understanding not just the serious nature of the industry, but its necessity in holding the economy up?
Absolutely. I think the pandemic definitely changed the nature of the conversation, and our issue has become front and center. I think it took a little bit longer, although we're starting to see it happen, to get policymakers to understand why private providers need to be involved in this conversation. And that I actually attribute to Build Back Better. We had to do a lot of advocacy to get some well-needed changes to the way that Build Back Better was originally written. And I think this really goes back to something that I've seen federally and at the state level, where a lot of policymakers think to solve this problem, they just need to be expanding financial assistance to more families and expanding subsidy. Well-intended thought process for sure, but in some cases, I asked the simple question: where are those families going to go? We already don't have enough providers participating in the subsidy program because the subsidy program is severely underfunded and it does not work for providers. And to expand that program, a very faulty program in many states, to more families is just expanding the problem. You're actually just going to create more of a backlog until you really address those root problems with financial assistance. And that's a great example of when we get into the details a bit, right? And we're evolving more past this, childcare is important issue that advocates have been trying for so many years to get in front of policymakers. And now we need to take it to the next level and talk about what are those policy levers that we need policymakers to pull, because, to be honest, there's some that are more urgent than others.
what do you, so I have a couple of follow-up questions. You sent me in a couple of different directions there and very interesting. We talked about expanded subsidy, so mainly through the Child Development Block Grant Program through states. Am I right about that? Okay.
Yep.
And the limited capacity to serve those children or to serve them at a tuition rate level that's sustainable, or, even works to cover the cost of basic care, much less a very high quality program. Do you also think, because I think this is the first time in my industry history, although it's happened before in isolated cases, but the majority of our clients are having to hold their enrollments artificially low because of staffing problems, and it's truly at a crisis level. I know that there are some funding sources that are left to discretion, or there's some funding sources that are specifically intended to prop up staff. A fear that I have is that with expanding tuition, expanding pay rates for staff, to prop those up with short-term funds concerns me, because we're not going backwards from there, right? I mean, the higher pay rates are here to stay. So how do you think all those pieces fit together? So we have the Child Development Block Grant Program. It sends money to states, usually call something different in each state. So people here might recognize it under a different name in their state. There are several issues. There's the amount in most states, the amount that they will pay doesn't generally cover the tuition rate that's needed to provide that service. And then the ability to serve children just because of staffing issues.
It's a great question. And I think, and just as a reminder, 50 billion with a B, $50 billion was appropriated in just relief funding for childcare since the pandemic. That's an unheard of number, and it's a lot of funding. And then it gets back to, well, we need to make sure states are making the right decisions with this funding. And I think now that states are sort of, rolling out the blueprint, so to speak, and taking a look at these systems, we're finally able to educate states on just why there were so many problems and gaps with the way that providers were being reimbursed for subsidy, for example. A big one was because the state would often use a market rate survey. So just sort of surveying the prices of the current market, and then kind of setting it along that survey. And some states are as low as the 40th, the 30th percentile. And so high quality providers are guaranteed to lose income essentially by taking on that family. Add in the fact that a lot of this funding is by attendance. So the child literally has to be present, and then take into account that providers often have to have additional staff just to process the administration of all of this. And it's quite lengthy and it's quite involved, and your teachers and directors are too busy to add that workload. So states need to start compensating for this, and we are seeing states take a look at those structural barriers when it comes to rates. And a great example is the switch away from a market rate survey to what we call a cost estimation model. You may have also heard this called a cost of quality study. But the purpose of this is to look into those factors that go into high quality care, such as staffing, which is a huge factor, and pay based off of those as opposed to just what is currently in the market. And that is a much better way to approach rates. And we have so far seen one state that has actually adopted that model. That's New Mexico. And the infant and toddler rates in New Mexico for subsidy went up so high that for many of our members, they were on par or at times higher than private pay rates. And for providers who may not have been in subsidy before, which is understandable, that's great. And that could be, you know, an incentive to finally join the subsidy system. So I think this is really about educating policymakers that in order for this industry to work properly and serve more families, it's got to be incentive based. It can't just be slapping down more rules and requirements. And this is especially the case with wages. I think if it would be a disaster if states just decided that they're going to require, you know, a higher wage for providers who already make such thin profit margins. They need to think of a more sustainable approach. Then we get to your problem that you just brought up, that the funding was one time, not sustainable. So what do we do from there? And this is where the advocacy really needs to be expansive. It has to be included. Obviously, federal advocacy is really important, but we can't let states off the hook. One thing I've learned with childcare over the 5 or so years that I've been in this field is that childcare funding is really, it can become the art of deferral, meaning the feds will blame the states will blame the feds, and then we don't really see a solution. I just brought up New Mexico. New Mexico went ahead and did a land lease tax on oil companies who are leasing land to pay for the changes that they're making in the state. And this is to make those changes sustainable, to make sure those rates can stay, to make sure continued investments, including other workforce supports such as scholarships and whatnot, to make sure all of that is still there and in place. That's really important. And while we will continue to pressure the feds, I also don't want states to just shrug their shoulders and wait for the feds.
Great information. Thank you. I meant to say at the beginning for everyone to put their questions in either the question bar or the chat. And I intended to wait until the last 15 or 20 minutes, but we have some great comments and questions. And so I'm going to integrate a few here for clarification, and everyone else just know that I'm not ignoring you. We do have time at the end and we'll get to as many as we can. We do have the question about could you explain a little bit more about what you mean by a mixed delivery recommendation? What is the vision of a mixed delivery system?
It's a great question, because if the definition of mixed delivery is not right, then it can still lead states. Actually, states could believe they're doing mixed delivery when they're actually not. We describe a healthy mixed delivery system as one that enables families to access a range of options that actually, it does include public schools. And I say that because when we talk with policymakers about this, I think in the past, providers have come across as anti-public school or anti-school. And we don't think that's the best messaging to appeal to policymakers. We still want schools to be involved, and we want private providers to be involved. And when it comes to early learning and childcare, enabling those families to choose, the option that works best for them is important. Now, mixed delivery is not just for childcare. We think it's really important for preschool as well. And that has to do with the fact that 4-year-olds often help keep the costs of infant and toddler care, which is incredibly expensive, especially with those low ratios, helps to keep those costs at bay. And so there's a big lesson in all of this is getting policymakers to understand just how interconnected the preschool and the childcare system are. And so we do want to emphasize mixed delivery preschool as well. I say that because California, we've had policymakers say that they think that this is mixed delivery, their proposal. And they think that providers can be a part of the before and after school for 4-year-olds, but not necessarily the instruction, right? And that's a problem when we're trying to talk about mixed delivery, and the policymakers think they're at mixed delivery. So actually, even though there's a big threat in California, a major win that happened in the budget this year is we got a definition of mixed delivery included in the budget. And that's going to be very helpful moving forward in California, especially when they have this mixed delivery language, because now we can go back to that definition. And I think this is something we want to be looking at in other states, because it's very easy for states to put the term mixed delivery into bills, but we need more accountability than that.
Yeah, we have several people here from California, and I'm going to save those for when we get a little bit more granular toward the end, and we can try to address some specific state questions. While we're staying up a little bit, 10,000 feet, where are we in so 50 billion? I can't not stop right here and say to everyone, and I've said this publicly many times, that ECEC was so instrumental in everything that happened for this industry in early COVID until now. And they were working so hard on our behalf to get those funding streams to childcare centers that largely made everyone survive. And I'm not exaggerating that at all. And I have so much respect for the work that you do. In early COVID, when I didn't know what else to do, I was interviewing you guys, and we were talking about the help that you guys were trying to get, and your team was talking to me on the weekends, and I just so appreciate everything that you guys did. But where are we in the 50 billion that has been earmarked for the industry? Is the majority of that out and accessible, or is it a mix, or do we have a lot more to come, or where are we in that?
Fantastic question, because I want advocates to be following that money. And in some states, it is easier to answer this question than others, because those states have been more transparent about how those funds have been spent. We have been really looking at the reporting data to the federal government, because states do have to report when this funding is spent. And I can tell you, some states are almost all the way through it, and some states have barely touched it, which is really disappointing when we're talking about an industry that currently really needs that support, to know that there are states that haven't really used that funding in a way to support the industry. I know, and to give more specifics, Virginia is about to spend the last of its ARPA stabilization funding. And it's doing one more round, and just divvying it all up, and then it'll all be gone. California, we don't know. And actually, this is something we've been trying to educate some California providers on, because in other states, there have been grants in the range of the hundreds of thousands of dollars to help keep childcare afloat during the pandemic. And all that California has done is a grant program of up to $6,500 for its childcare programs. That is actually horrifying to me, that a state would give so little. $6,500, like, I don't even know what that gets out of center, except maybe like half a week's worth of salary or something. But it was very disappointing to see that. And I think the most important thing for advocates to understand are the deadlines. So for the stabilization funding that was included in the American Rescue Plan, so that's about $25 billion. States have 13 months, I guess. Now, September 30th, 2023 is the deadline to liquidate that funding. And if they don't liquidate it by that date, they have to return that funding to the feds. And so for those states that have not spent that money, and ECEC has been patient. We know that, we don't want to underscore that the task that was put on states to get this money out to all providers is completely new. But now we're in a phase where we've seen most states do it, and I think the expectations have shifted. So once we get into the final year of that funding needing to be spent, ECEC is going to be very active on trying to get those states to spend that funding. And then a year later, in September 30th, 2024, is when the remaining funds need to be spent. And that includes from the CARES Act, the CURSA Act, which was passed a couple months before the American Rescue Plan, and then the second half of the child care funding in the American Rescue Plan Act, which is more discretionary, and states have a little bit more control over the decision making on that. So there is a timeline here, and we need states to spend this money in a way that is helpful to the industry. And actually, I think workforce is a really good example. Some states have been really helpful in providing retention grants. Actually, New Jersey, for example, Massachusetts, they've given providers retention grants and recruitment grants to retain and recruit employees. That's very helpful. But then there are other states, and I've seen this time and time again, who are, providing free online training or coaching. And while that's helpful, I never would say that's not helpful. I think we know, though, that there are decisions that could be made that are much more helpful to providers. And this is why we need the provider voice at the table. Because if we're not saying this, then states are not only going to do these things, but they're going to walk away and consider these wins. And if providers aren't speaking up, then we're not going to get the support that we need with that funding.
I want to address that a little bit more in just a minute. You mentioned that there are some trendsetter states, and I love that because hopefully there are models and there's sharing of information about what's working well and what isn't. You also mentioned the cost estimation model, which is fantastic. And I'd love to hear a little bit about how you feel about that. Is it actually in practice better than a market survey, which can be misleading as to true cost of care? But can you talk a little bit about the trendsetters? You mentioned Colorado with universal preschool and possibly 10 hours a week. You mentioned Washington and Massachusetts. What states do you feel like are leaders, and what are they doing well?
Yeah, and I would add New Mexico to that list. And I'll actually start off with Colorado and New Mexico. They're neighbors, and I also have a New Mexico connection, so I like talking about New Mexico. One thing that they did, and this is something that is a great example of, it's a policy decision that providers might not understand in the beginning how it affects their bottom line, but it really does make things so much easier when we get to the other side of things. And that is that both states have created new departments of early childhood. And in New Mexico's case, they actually gave the secretary of that department cabinet level authority. And what that does is a couple of things. It enables a singular department to really look at the entire early learning system, not just childcare, but preschool as well, and streamline and coordinate and make it a more efficient system. Now, some states have done this for a long time. Georgia has had a Department of Early Care and Learning, or DCAL, since 2004. So this isn't necessarily new, but there has been an uptick in the last few years of states either creating a new department or consolidating at least into a singular department. On the other side of that, there are still states that have these departments divvied up childcare subsidy might be in one department, say like a Department of Human Services. Childcare regulations might be in a different department, let's say a Department of Health. And then preschool, it might be an entirely separate department, a Department of Education, for example. I think that's actually very common, what I just described. And when that happens, you don't necessarily have departments that are necessarily going to take responsibility for what is happening in the field. You know, why would the Department of Education care if, you know, public preschool is taking away from childcare? Childcare is not in their purview, right? So these decisions are actually instrumental when it comes to trying to design mixed delivery policy. And New Mexico has done it. Then after New Mexico did this, we've seen all these great decisions come out of New Mexico, this great strategic thinking. And then Colorado did it as a precursor to universal preschool, which we think is fantastic, because otherwise universal preschool would have been ran out of the Department of Education, and it would have continued to be separate, and we just wouldn't have had the confidence that this would have been a strong mixed delivery system. Now California still has them divvied up, right? New Jersey still has them divvied up. And one of the bills actually that was introduced in New Jersey was a bill to create a new Department of Early Childhood. And so I say this because I think, you know, a lot of providers or a lot of those in the industry might not really understand why creating a new department can make things easier for them. But I call this an example of an upstream policy change. You know, we're dealing with all the downstream effects, but if you really want to make some serious change, you got to go up the stream and you got to fix it there. And I think creating a new department and also in that creation, making sure mixed delivery is part of that department's calling. That's an upstream policy change that can really have some great positive effects for providers.
Awesome. It sounds like it's difficult to get a handle on where individual states are globally with their practices and their spending. If our guests in their own states wanted to know where their state was, what they were appropriated, where it stands, what they're doing with it, how do they get that information?
That is a really, really good question. I can say that this is information that we pull for our members. But it is very complicated. There is a federal website that they can check. I think a good place to start though is understanding the terminology and the difference between when we say that something was liquidated, you know, so the money was actually spent, versus when something was obligated or when something was announced. And this is really important because this is when, you know, you've heard the phrase follow the money. I think it's more important for people to follow how the money was actually spent. You know, the state could appropriate $50 million for grants, but what we don't know is how many people applied for those grants, how many people received those grants. Oftentimes there was funding left over. So I don't like to necessarily look at what was obligated. I like to look at what was liquidated. And to me, the best way to get that answer is to check federal reporting. And we can send over, you know, as follow-ups some websites on where you can check that federal reporting. But you know, it's difficult. This is still politics we're talking about. And so states will do what they can to say they've spent money or talk about how they've spent money. But, you know, I until I see the numbers, I have little faith that that's the actually the case. And so that's why I recommend double checking with the feds.
Yes, we would love to have that link to pass along to our guests, Jake, and to everyone here. We will follow up with a link to the federal reporting so that you can start to get familiar with where your state stands. What's your advice, Jake, if our guests feel like, and I know a lot of people here, and I know that they're very active in their states, and I know that there are a lot of other people who find it difficult to get involved. They also have a very difficult business to run. What is your recommendation for approaching individual states to be a part of the solution and to try to be sure that money streams get spent in a way that are really effective for children? How should people get started if they're not on that path?
It's a great question. And I just want to underscore that providers are busy and they don't have the time. And I actually I would feel guilty kind of pushing them to somehow make the time when they're already strapped. That said, I think that there is a way for them to help support the efforts that might be happening in their state. One thing I want to highlight is a state association. And a state association, those are meant to be the voice that's at the table for providers. Unfortunately, with the pandemic and sort of the economic insecurity as a result of the pandemic, we've seen a lot of state association memberships dwindle, of course. Providers trying to save money when they can, or unfortunately, providers had to close altogether. And I can tell you from my perspective, and I work closely with a number of state associations, that money really makes a difference. And even just 5 or 10 new members can really affect the messaging that and the resources for that messaging that those associations have. More importantly, those associations can keep you apprised of what's going on, can let you know when you need to share your voice, and can hopefully make it easy for you. Make it as simple as, sending an email or making a phone call so that you can concentrate, on your business. And then also it gives you a place to voice your concerns, voice where you're seeing problems. So that's one area. Another area though, and I know there's a lot of people out there who are really good at relationship building. So I think it is absolutely worthwhile to, think of a legislator that represents your district. It could be federal, it could be state. They likely have a local office somewhere in your district or in your county. Just make friends with one of them, and there are people there. And actually, I'm going to bring in my Senate experience for you. So, even though I worked for U.S. Senator, and I know that a lot of people, it can be intimidating to reach out to a senator's office, but our office had local offices in every district in New Mexico, and we had staff in those local offices, and those staff would sometimes form relationships with local business folks, and were able to communicate those concerns upward. And they actually do take those concerns seriously. Those are local folks who are from the community. And I really think it's worthwhile to establish that connection. Can seem like it's hard and overwhelming to do, but you go to their website, you'll see they have a number for each of those offices. And I think that's a really great way just to have a relationship there. You may not even need to do anything, but those people are often very friendly and very local, and not as intimidating as maybe some of the DC folks are.
I love knowing that those local messages make their way to Washington, and that you feel like that's an effective form of communication. We work with a lot of the state associations as well, and there's some fantastic ones that work very hard on behalf of the industry. We also know there's some states that have associations, but they aren't quite as active. And I think there's some states that don't have associations at all. Of course, it's a big job to form an association. So I would love to think that that might happen from someone's work in their state, but also understand how difficult that is. I have one more question, and then I'd love for us to tackle some of these that our guests have. And again, you guys feel free to use the chat bar or the questions. We'll hit as many as we can in this hour. What do you think the future is going to look like for childcare funding? Do you think that we are going to plateau and go back to the status quo, which was basically child development block grant funding? Of course, a lot of our clients participate in the USDA food program. That's a big source of money. Head Start, in some cases, a lot of our clients do some Head Start collaborations, and there are some public school collaborations as well. I love the funding that's propped us up during COVID. I think it's recognized that the industry is struggling greatly with staffing issues, and I've been saying 18 to 24 months, we'll see significant fundings, but I think that you just put a date on that for me. So it actually is, closing in on 24 months, maybe 25 months. What do you think the future is like? Do you get the feeling that we'll continue to see support and that COVID was really a turning point? Do you think that our government's going to start to look somewhere else and prioritize other things? I know this is largely an opinion, but how do you feel about that? What do you think will happen?
$1 million question, and I am happy to kind of share where we're at and talk about the next steps. Most of you may have heard, but I'll just say, just in case you haven't, that what we used to call Build Back Better, which has taken different shapes over the last year or so and different names, has now been the Inflation Reduction Act. And it has officially passed. It was actually signed into law yesterday by President Biden. But unfortunately, it did not include the childcare funding that we were hoping to see when Build Back Better was initially created. There are many reasons for that. A big one being, who was at the negotiating table, and I think it's obvious which senators were. And now that this is over, I think the advocacy community really needs to think about what's next. It doesn't mean that we're out of options. We still have some legislative days before the end of the year. So the next step will be looking at something bipartisan that we can pass through regular order. Now, back in March, we actually did see a bill get introduced from Senator Tim Scott and Senator Richard Burr, so North Carolina, South Carolina. They introduced a CCDBG Reauthorization Act. Now, there wasn't necessarily any funding to go with this. However, there were some good things that we saw from Build Back Better that were still taken into account with this act. Currently, there are, I think, 11 Senate Republicans that have added their name as a co-sponsor to that bill. And to me, that's 11 potential votes for a bipartisan solution. And in the Senate, we would need to get to 60. So I know in this day of political division, it can feel very unlikely that something bipartisan would happen. But childcare for a long time has been a bipartisan issue. And I think that that's when our advocacy, and by the way, when I say our, I'm also talking about you, that's when our advocacy matters. So I think we need to be actively reaching out to Republicans and Democrats. In October, you're going to see a big campaign push from a lot of folks ahead of the midterms. That means they're going to be hosting town halls and other events. And I absolutely would urge you to raise your voice. If you can attend one of those, to try to raise your voice and make them commit to getting something across the finish line before the end of December. And that's the timeline we're working with, which makes the conference even more well-timed, I think, because we'll have a lot of insight into how those talks are going. But we're really hoping to get something passed by the end of December. Now, if nothing does get passed, we could always look ahead to the next legislative session. And I think that's when there's a lot of factors that are unknown. Who is going to be in the majority for the House and Senate, for example, and who's going to be leadership. Even something like the Senate committee, the Health Committee, which handles childcare and early learning, they're going to have likely different leadership. And right now it's Patty Murray and Richard Burr who have been able to work together for a while. Next session, it will be Bernie Sanders and Rand Paul. Two people who I think the hopes for them working together. Now that could change, but right now they are the ranking for each side. So one could just presume that it would be those two. So I think there's a lot of factors that it depends where that goes. I think the main thing we need to communicate, though, is that the way that we fund childcare right now just is not working. Now, we do that through an annual appropriations process. And we are seeing that right now there's a $1 billion increase for CCDBG on the table for this year, which is great. However, factor in inflation and we have to ask the question, is that enough? And I think one thing that states have been complaining about for a long time is that it's really hard for states to make long-term decisions when they only know the funding for the next year. And so trying to get out of this year-to-year appropriations process and into something that is more long-term, even if it's just 5 or 10 years, which is what Build Back Better was aiming to do, I think is something we should absolutely be asking for.
Awesome. Well, let's take a couple of questions. I want to address this one first. Would you give different advice to family childcare home providers or home-based childcare for being sure that their voices are heard, or are your recommendations the same?
They're roughly the same. I would definitely encourage you to find an organization that is well versed in family childcare and can represent your needs well. Sometimes that is an association that is able to do that, but sometimes associations really are focused on center-based, and there might be a family childcare association. Maryland's a great example of this. There is there's a Maryland State Childcare Association, and then there's a Family Childcare Association. I happen to know that, leadership in both. I know that they work together as often as they can, but they also respect that they serve unique needs for their members. So I would just make sure that whatever entity it is, that they are well equipped to handle the very specific issues that family childcare providers are up against.
So largely the same avenues. Hopefully there's an association with a focus there, but also a local meeting with a legislative team would be a great place to go.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay.
And policymakers really want to hear from family childcare providers. I'm also going to add, I know some of you are in states that may not have these organized entities. And in those cases, I would actually advise you to maybe seek national, if there's any way to get plugged in nationally. And you don't always have to pay money for those. There's ways to get to sign up for national updates. We actually co-host a call within the National Child Care Association called Champions of Mixed Delivery. We try to provide federal updates and talk about some trends. So there's a way for you to get connected nationally in those cases that your state may lack the ability to have an association.
Awesome, thank you. There's a question around, I think we can speak to this in a little more detail that I raised early on, because this is one of my fears for the industry right now. I'll read the question and, give you the Kathy answer and see if you agree. With teachers demanding higher wages, which we are able to meet with current grant money, or when current grant money is available, how will we be able to continue to match these pay rates when grants are gone and maintain a profit to keep our doors open? Well, my message, this is a fear for me, because we recognize that your cost of care has increased greatly since COVID. And all of it wasn't COVID related. I think the majority of it was the demand on wages. There were some supply changes and things like that. But the demand on wages is scary to me if they're being propped up with grant funding. We're seeing providers do record tuition rate increases and really try to be sure that they're moving in the right direction with the cost of care. You can stretch those decisions out a bit if you're propping up with grant funds. What you don't want to do is neglect that and be left with no appropriate tuition, and now your salaries are still the same thing. So do you have other thoughts on that, Jake, about the viability of the industry if people are having to use those short-term funds for things like increased wages?
Yeah, and I'll add in for some states that have mixed delivery issues and are taking 4-year-olds away, the expectation to increase wages suddenly becomes harder. You just described exactly what we should be advocating to policymakers. We should be telling this story. And I do think, and this is a really great question, because I think this is something we need to talk about more. I'll just quickly, knowing time, I'll just quickly highlight sort of 2 glimpses of solutions to help move forward. One is the very last version of Build Back Better that we saw, which again, we really pushed committee staff to rewrite that many times. The very last version, which is the Murray-Cain, Senator Patty Murray and Senator Tim Kaine released a proposal. They had something called wage supplement grants available to all providers. And this is something we really encouraged policymakers to capitalize on the success of ARPA. And we consider ARPA, I know it's short term, but it's besides from that, very successful in terms of supporting the entire field of providers. They had that written in, these wage supplement grants. I believe it was about 17 billion or something that was appropriated for that, which, basically taking this grant structure and making it longer term, we thought was great. The Massachusetts Universal Childcare Bill, it has not been passed yet. It'll be reintroduced next year. It has a lot of support in the state, though. It has something called bedrock funding, available to all providers who are licensed. And this bedrock funding model would function similarly to a continuation of the stabilization grant program. And one thing I want to emphasize here is that I know often in this field, we have this sort of wall between subsidized and non, private pay centers. When it comes to the workforce, we need to take down that wall. We shouldn't necessarily act like the only workforce we're talking about are the ones in subsidy centers. We're talking about an entire workforce that is interconnected. And I think that's one obstacle we'll be up against, but we absolutely should take this advocacy to local, state, and federal policymakers.
Another question. There's so many questions, y'all. I'm going to try to follow up with as many questions back out to the group as I can with the limited time here. Is there any discussion about health insurance plans that might support licensed childcare staff?
Those discussions are happening, and they're happening at the state level. And I think this is a new idea, again, an example of something the state is trying to do to make it happen. But in some states, the idea process, the brainstorming process is happening. I think, though, we need more voices to actually bring up these ideas to policymakers, because I think that is something where the provider perspective and then the owner operator perspective is absolutely critical.
Wonderful. I feel like I need to do a follow-up session on the financial implications of the short-term funding, because I've had several questions here and I do have very strong opinions about it and really want to be an advocate for our operators that have worked so hard to have financially healthy schools and are in a little jeopardy right now. I so appreciate you, Jake. I can't wait for our session in December at our shift conference. I know some of our guests here will also be there. We're looking forward to an update from you on where states are in process with their spending and a little more detailed information on where that stands and what we can do about it. But I could have used about 5 hours of your brain, but we'll just keep on plugging into it. And we love the work that you guys are doing, appreciate everything you're doing on our behalf, and appreciate your time today and helping us understand this complicated, very complicated information.
And Kathy, thank you and your team for helping out, and thanks to all of you. I mean, you're the ones that are doing the real hard work, as I like to say, and our work depends on your feedback and you know, you letting us know what the problems are. So even me hearing the questions and knowing what's top of mind for providers, that is so helpful. So thank you to all of you. And I know these are hard times, but keep it up. Really, thank you.
Agree. Thanks so much, Jake. See you soon.
All right. Thank you.
Take care. Be well, friends.